Hello, my name is Nigel Thorne. I'm from Wales and I'm concerned about the Welsh Government's RSE code, which provides statutory guidance for head teachers of schools in Wales. In a previous video, I showed how the code requires head teachers to accept a new definition of the word gender. It should no longer be regarded as synonymous with sex, as defined in the Oxford English Dictionary. It should instead be used to refer to how someone identifies. This instruction comes straight out of queer theory, a philosophical idea created by American academic Judith Butler, which is being introduced into Welsh schools by Cardiff University academic Professor Emma Reynolds. Butler believes that power lies within language, and that the language that is used to refer to sex categories or biological sex is heteronormative and oppresses those who are gender non-conforming. To undermine this oppressive language, Butler proposes changing our discourse to downplay the significance of sex and elevate the significance of an internal gender. In the RSE code, there is no mention of the sex categories, male and female, but there are 17 references to the word gender. In the Designing Your Curriculum page on the Hub website, the word sex is defined as being attributed to a person, rather than as being an immutable aspect of our humanity. The word gender is defined as being often used to refer to whether someone identifies as male, female, or non-binary. In another video, I explored how many young people, influenced by both social media and Butler's idea, have subscribed to an ideological belief that all of us have an innate gender identity that may or may not align with our sexed bodies, and that gender identity is the real determining factor as to whether we are a man or a woman. Scientifically, this is baloney. However, this ideology is promoted by Stonewall, a highly influential lobbying group which has links to many schools and local authorities. Trans woman Debbie Hayton explains her understanding of gender identity.
This weekend, the Ofsted inspectors are using the lack of gender identity teaching as a reason for downgrading primary schools. According to a report in The Telegraph, one school was told it requires improvement and mentioned prominently that pupils do not learn about gender identity or gender diversity. Another school was marked as inadequate, which is the lowest grade. Their report referred to a lack of gender reassignment teaching. So to discuss this story, I'm joined by the transgender teacher and journalist, Debbie Hayton. Thank you so much for joining me. This is an interesting one because there have been lots of controversies around gender identity and how it ought to be tackled in an educational scenario. Do you think that it is right that schools should be marked down for not promoting this particular worldview?
Well, I think what you said there was promoting a worldview. Schools should be there to teach children facts. They should be able to teach children information and teach children that different people have different opinions. But what seems to come here is that there is one particular ideology, this idea that we all have a gender identity which makes us male or female, and that's what, according to what I read in The Telegraph, children are expected to be taught.
So they're not being told, well, there are people who have a gender identity or feel differently about their nature, and this is a reality of life. They're being taught that this is a thing, that you all have a gender identity. Is that the problem here?
Yeah, because I don't think anybody has a gender identity. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's necessary to explain that somebody's trans. But this descriptive idea, this almost a lazy description that somebody who struggled with their sex, struggled with their biological sex, had a gender identity, it was descriptive. And it's become a definitive concept which defines us. So you're teaching children about gender identity as something definitive. It can't be proved, it can't be checked, it can't be falsified. I think it's nonsense.
But you say that you don't have a gender identity, and yet people will look at you and say, but this is a trans individual. So surely you must have had some sense of discomfort with who you were.
Yes, but I don't think we need a gender identity to have a discomfort with our sex. Lots of people have a discomfort with their sex, But why do we need to invent this concept called gender identity to explain it? I don't think we do. We just say, you've got a problem with your sex.
Is there any kind of consensus within the trans community on this? Because often we hear of the trans community and that there is a kind of homogenous view therein. But actually, there's a lot of debates going on, aren't there, about this?
There are, but most people within the trans community, to use that term, I really dislike it actually. But most transgender people, the goal the goal used to be to transition and reintegrate into society and get on with life. It was a solution to a psychological distress. That was all it was.
When it comes to children, I was talking earlier to Kate and Bev from LGB Alliance, and one of their concerns is the ways in which gender non-conforming children who don't seem naturally boyish or naturally girlish, are, in a sense, being encouraged to believe that perhaps they are in the wrong body. Do you think that this is a natural corollary of gender identity ideology, or is that perhaps overstating it?
Well, by creating this concept called gender identity, you've created this concept that somebody can be born in the wrong body, a boy in a girl's body, rather than saying you're a girl who likes playing with trucks, you're a boy who likes playing with dolls. We should be letting children be themselves and not saying, here's a different identity which you've got to identify into in order to exist. That's what we shouldn't be doing.
So why is it then we hear from groups like Ofsted, of all people, or indeed the NHS, or these sort of major institutions, who all appear to be in lockstep over this issue? They all seem to be of the view that there is such a thing as gender identity, we all have it, and that to promote or to suggest otherwise is transphobic or hateful. What do you make of that?
Well, it's who's been training them. Those are the questions we need to be asking. Who has been training Ofsted? Who's been training the NHS? Who's been training all these other organisations that have all got the same ideas? It's the people who have been doing the training have been spreading this ideology.
And who is that?
Well, there are a number of trans organisations. Stonewall UK has been training. Groups like Gendered Intelligence, groups like Mermaids, they've been running training courses and selling this, and again, I keep coming back to the word, an ideology that we all have a gender identity.
So in a sense, in order to challenge this, first we have to address the problem of these viewpoints being disseminated by various groups who are often government funded. We see the same in the civil service, we see the same in the various quangos, even in the College of Policing. So it is something that is everywhere. This is going to take an awful lot to untie, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it is. When I talk to people, I will often say, who told you this and why did you believe them? And the reaction is something that people have taken these ideas on board without thinking critically themselves. A trainer comes in and says everybody's got a gender identity, and they say, well, okay, fair enough. But as adults, we should always be challenging what information we're given, or else we might be being sold nonsense.
I suppose, though, people are trying to be, it's kind of well-intentioned because they don't want to feel like they see and they hear about trans people being discriminated against, facing abuse and that kind of thing, and they don't want to be part of that. So they think this is maybe a way to address that.
Well, people want to be kind. But I would come back to the fact that I don't think gender identity exists. I don't think it's necessary. Is it kind to be encouraging trans people and the rest of society to be believing in an ideology, I think, which is fundamentally false?
When you listen to children, what you hear is the voice of the culture in which they are immersed. And the culture is one that has been infused with queer theory and gender identity ideology. It is not the job of teachers to indulge a fiction. It is the job of teachers to teach the truth. On Professor Reynolds' Vimeo site is a video made by pupils at Ysgol Plasmawr in Cardiff. It was made with the purpose of lobbying the Welsh Government.
We're Digon, a group within Ysgol Plasmawr in Cardiff that tackles LGBTQ+ phobia within our school and aims to educate our pupils on respect and issues that concern the LGBTQ+ community.
Gone are the days of a tick box culture for LGBTQ+ inclusive education where we get
one-off lessons on straight sex and STIs,
a school assembly video on heteronormative consent,
a walk-in, walk-out diversity role model,
an equality policy that sits on a website but is not put into action,
a tokenistic and out-of-date Stonewall poster on a corridor wall that's curling at the edges,
not dealing with the T and Q in LGBTQ.
We are not a pick and mix community.
Schools can't decide which version of LGBTQ+ they are comfortable with supporting.
LGBTQ+ is not black and white, but we are not all rainbows.
We are diverse and a big group, yes, but don't put us in brackets. Can we just normalise queer identities and keep the diversity moving through the whole curriculum?
We are fed up with teachers only dealing with queer phobia when it's convenient for them.
When breaking the school dress code is taken more seriously than rape threats.
We want 100 boxes ticked every day. We want to learn about the legalisation of being LGBTQ+.
The Stonewall Uprising.
The history of pride and how it's important.
How to be a good ally.
Intersectionality.
The importance of untokenistic representation.
How queer relationships work.
We need this because it's important for queer kids to get an equal education of relationships and sexualities. It normalises LGBTQ+ identities for everyone, and it makes the world a more accepting, understanding and easier place to live. Don't simplify, don't erase us.
The lobbying was successful. It is now mandatory to teach gender identity in Welsh schools. In a bulletin sent to head teachers in 5 local authorities in Wales in October 2022, it stated, when designing and delivering their RSE curriculum, schools must design it in a way that is inclusive, including LGBTQ+ inclusivity. This should lead schools to reflect on how inclusive its RSE curriculum and indeed its curriculum as a whole is, considering if the resource it uses provide a range of different, diverse and inclusive examples of individuals' identities. It is mandatory that schools promote inclusivity of TQ+ identities. It is not mandatory for schools to teach about the dangers of gender identity ideology. Dr. James Caspian speaks about how queer theory ideologues influenced the creation of the Memorandum of Understanding on Conversion Therapy version 2.
But it was pretty clear to me that there was an agenda behind the memorandum. And what that agenda was actually was coming from people who are coming from a very different place from those of us who might have worked clinically and medically. It was coming from people who had more of a political and ideological interest in gender identity and not necessarily in medical transition at all. In fact, most of the people I've observed who seem to be most active in that element of the memorandum are not in any way connected to medical transition. So that wasn't on their minds. I think what was on their minds was that they believed that there were these huge cohorts of young people who really were trans, whatever that is, because that's not something that's ever really established what it is. I mean, I can tell you from working in a clinic that people come and ask for treatment for lots of different reasons. There isn't one kind of intrinsic trans person, there are people, there are just individuals with different feelings about themselves, trying to make sense of themselves. So I think the people who were angling for this memorandum had an ideological and political motivation to try to, they're kind of iconoclasts. They want to have a kind of gender revolution where you completely break down any kind of binary gender roles. I mean, they talk about gender identity, but I see it more in terms of roles, the gender roles that people have, how men are meant to be and how women are meant to be, and the kind of collective assumptions and history of all that. It's quite complex and deep. So I think they wanted to make it that, you couldn't argue with someone who said, well, I'm this other gender identity, or I'm that, or I'm non-binary, or I'm one of the many, there's 72 different genders on one thing I looked at. So I think that's what they were thinking. Yeah, I think that's what they were thinking. They wanted to educate these ignorant therapists that there are all these other ways of being out there and all these different gender identities, and you're going to have to agree with that. But what they haven't realised that actually this is going to affect people medically, and that thousands and thousands of people are transitioning and then saying they regretted and detransitioning, and there is the evidence out there that is the case.
In the same bulletin sent to head teachers in Wales in October 2022, there is a link to a keynote presentation by Professor Reynolds titled Keynote 4, Transforming Relationships and Sexuality Education in Wales.
Hi everyone, my name is Professor E.J. Reynolds, and I am here to share with you a very brief introduction to Wales's new statutory relationships and sexuality education. We have been privileged to design and deliver professional learning to schools in South Central Consortia for over 4 years now, with Dr. Esther McGeaney and more recently Dr. Leanne Cole. What you will hear today in this short pre-recorded webinar is an overview of the new RSE and a little bit of how you can move forward in preparing for the changes that are coming.
In the presentation, Professor Reynolds states that children's rights to RSE are protected by ending the parental right to withdraw.
Children's rights to RSE is also now protected by ending the parental right to withdraw. So parents no longer be able to withdraw their children from RSE, which means that all children will now have the right to participate in this new, holistic, developmentally appropriate RSE.
Of course, children themselves have no right to opt out of RSE teaching. They're compelled to attend. To regard it as a child's right to be taught the RSE material created by Professor Reynolds is laughable. The object of the RSE material created by her is to indoctrinate school pupils with the goal of undermining a perceived heteronormativity. In other parts of society, changing language with the intent of changing people's perceptions is regarded as fraud and is a criminal offence. If it is not a criminal offence to indoctrinate our children with an ideology that may have a detrimental impact on their future physical or mental health, then it should be. Much of the rest of the recorded webinar is an advert for Professor Reynolds' ideologically driven resource, Agenda.
So this brings the presentation to a close. There are many more films linked to the professional learning programme that you will have access to via the CSE platform. But I just wanted to share with you the resources and the resource base, the evidence resource base that we have been kind of creating over the years. So some of the case studies, like making RSE webs, there are many more school case studies of getting started inside the Crush resource. So the Crush resource is a resource for practitioners. It shares our journey of professional learning with examples moving forward and resources such as like, how do I begin on a whole school approach to RSE? How do I map across all 6 AOLEs to ensure that the strand is explored across in a cross-curricular way, and other resources as well about different organisations that can support you moving forward. So the Crush resource is an evolving resource. We are currently in the process of updating that resource in alignment with the new RSE code, including work on the 3 strands, and look at the Crush resource for something more bespoke for Wales that reflects and shares how we are working with teachers on their journey to prepare for the new statutory relationships and sexuality education.
The agenda resource has been removed from Hub, but it is still accessible through Spectrum, and teachers have already been trained to use it. Those parents who would prefer that teachers taught facts rather than ideology may wish to support Public Child Protection Wales and their campaign against their new curriculum.